Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to today's bonus upload. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads that I put out daily, click that bell icon. And folks, please leave a comment and share the video. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. They definitely do matter, and they are appreciated. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump into today's bonus, shall we? And today's first encounter. It was that time of year again for our annual caribou hunting trip back in 1989. My hunting partner and I ventured into the area below the Kewetinock Ridge alongside the Kewetinock River in British Columbia. We were working the area between the river and Mounts Maripole and Caribou, with Hamilton Ridge to our south. It was a crisp morning, and we were seeing some animals start to move, with none of them being to our liking, and the distance between us and the herd was far too great as well. Having seen the activity, we decided to follow in the direction of the herd in hopes of seeing a more substantial animal at some point. We had made our way all the way down to where the warden's cabin was located on the southwest side of Hamilton Ridge, and were now at the point where we were sandwiched between Hamilton and Tosher Ridge, respectively. At this point, my partner and I were sitting with our bodies facing opposite directions. I was combing Hamilton Ridge with my binoculars, while my buddy was combing Kewetinock with his. We had to have been sitting there for over an hour observing the movements of a number of caribou, when my buddy said, "I have never seen a timber wolf that big in my entire life. You gotta check this out." On his cue, I turned and began to fix my binoculars on the area in which he was now pointing. At this point, the two of us are now sitting with eyes fixed on what appeared to be a wolf that was the size of a bull elk, a fact which was in of itself hard to digest mentally. The distance was great, but based on the size of the larger caribou which it was stalking, walking well below them, it was twice the size of the largest male, which did not make any sense at all. To me, what I was witnessing was an impossibility in the natural world. A timber wolf at this size would have been in the neighborhood of 500 pounds, which just cannot be. As I was looking at it, I said to my partner, "It must be a bear." But even as I said it, I didn't believe my own words, and the coloration was not right for a bear, and yet the rump sat too high with the spine to be a profile of a wolf. It was truly a puzzling sight for both of us. We sat watching this creature, obviously stalking the herd from the lower position on the ridge. It must have been about 20 minutes later, as we both sat watching intently, that this creature lifted off the ground with what we believed to be its front legs, which were now hanging from the body, and began to make its way up the hill toward the herd, appearing just as a hunter would, holding his rifle, trying to get a closer look without being seen. This thing was now walking hunched over like a man. It made its way into position behind some brush, where it once again squatted down and was evidently watching the activity above it, as we were. The herd was lumbering along and had to have consisted of over 50 animals or more. when suddenly, as we watched, this creature made a lightning-fast movement, closing the gap between itself and the herd, repositioning itself between another grouping of brush just below them. A couple of the caribou seemed to be momentarily startled as they began to trot, but then all things settled down again. Just moments later, this creature launched itself into an uphill and diagonal run. Aiming toward the middle of the herd, the animals began to run, but the creature, being much faster to our eyes, closed the gap quickly and launched its body, swatting a female to the ground with what appeared to be one blow from its now extended arm. Very much like a grizzly would whack down an animal from the back in a chase. It was now on top of the caribou, thrashing at its body in a violent manner with both of its now apparent arms. This creature, while straddling the caribou's body, had thrown so many blows in such a brief amount of time, it was inconceivable how many had actually been thrown. This was followed by a long pause where it just sat atop its victim, apparently resting and eyeing its prize. Some 15 minutes later or so, this wolf-man-like creature stood on its feet and hoisted the caribou, placing it over its shoulders like a woman wearing a mink stole, and began to walk down the slope, angling to our north. It was then that I said to my partner, "I have to see its face." And leveling my sight on the hill in front of it, I pulled the trigger, firing a single shot, the sound of which bounced back and forth between the two ridges, and it was loud. As soon as the blast occurred, this wolf-man stopped in its tracks and looked directly at us. Immediately, my buddy said to me, "Look at that sucker's head. He has a long snout and pointed ears, and it's damn half-human wolf," he said, "right? Its body was long and lanky, covered it with what was gray hair or fur, and from our perspective, it had a long but tapered snout like a gray wolf, with what seemed to be a variety of coloration in its face. Its ears were protruding upward from its head like two small triangles, and there was no doubt about it, and it stood there apparently unafraid of who we were or what we could potentially do to it for almost 2 minutes. This creature then began to trot away with what was some of the most longest strides I had ever seen across the face of the ridge at the speed which was quite simply not achievable by any man. And all of this while shouldering what must have been a 200 to 300 pound animal on its back. In what was a matter of only a few minutes, this creature had covered about half a mile and disappeared into the timber at the base of our north. My partner and I sat back to compare notes about what we had seen. When we had seen it on the caribou straddling it, the back was lean and V-shaped, appearing to be very muscular. When the arms began to thrash at the fallen caribou, they were extremely long, and the movements were performed at a speed which seemed like a blur to our eyes. After having risen to its feet, it hoisted the body around its neck and shoulders like you would lift a 5-pound bag of potatoes, as if it was nothing. I think the craziest moment of all was when we saw it lift up from being on all fours to 2 legs, which was the defining moment of our sighting. This singular movement completely blew us out of the water. We both at that point knew that we were seeing something totally unique and quite frankly extraordinary, if not supernatural. And yet there it was, hunting, walking, attacking a flesh and blood animal for food. It was simply incredible. My second encounter. I was working the timber northeast of Kluchman Rock on the western edge of Queets River. I'd hiked in about 4 miles from Queets Ranger Station and was set up against a tall pine near the edge of what appeared to be a well-used game trail. Being unfamiliar with the location, and after about 2 hours of seeing nothing, I decided to backtrack to an area I had passed through on my hike in that looked pretty good, and once again positioned myself with my back against a large fir. I don't think that I was sitting there for more than 10 minutes when I shifted my body to get more comfortable and something jabbed me right in my ass. I stood up and looked down at the ground, moving some of the mulch and crap out of the way in order to see what I had sat on. I immediately started to uncover what appeared to me to be a human metacarpal, or metatarsal bones. In other words, these were bones from either a human's hand or foot. I was convinced they were human and not animal, having sat through many hours of skeletal anatomy classes, but what they were doing here by this tree was anyone's guess. I set my gun against the tree and grabbed a branch and started to clear away more debris on the ground surrounding the base of this large fir tree. As I did so, I uncovered more bones, which I was now certain were the ulnar radius humerus bones from a human arm. This now told me that these bones I had first found were in fact a metacarpal and phalanges from the same arm. I was alone, and I distinctly remember a raw chill going through my entire body as I realized what I had uncovered. Having been there, I can speak in all honesty that there was something very eerie about standing in a spot where an unburied human had met their apparent demise, and yet there I found myself alone, deep in the woods. I had actually cleared a decent-sized little area with the branch to uncover what I had found as far as bones were concerned, and I couldn't see nor find any more, so I stood there trying to make some sense out of having found partial human remains next to a tree. It was then that I started to think, as anyone would, just how is it that a human arm and nothing else found its way into the woods detached from its owner? I remember standing there rubbing my forehead with my fingers as I was trying to make some sense of it all, when something told me to look up, and I did. The initial set of substantial boughs in the large tree actually began protruding from the trunk some 30 feet or so from the ground. As I looked up, my eyes were immediately drawn to some colored fabric draped across one of those branches. I could now see enough to realize that I was looking at the remains of a clothed human being lying across this large branch. It was directly above where I had found the bones of the arm and hand. I immediately took note of the fact that there was no tree stand or climbing apparatus attached to the trunk, nor were there smaller limbs that a man or anything else could have supported themselves on to climb this tree to that height. This person had either shimmied up that tree and died, or something else had done the same, carrying him up there. There was no backpack or weapon of any sort visible on the ground surrounding the tree. No sooner had I come to grips with what I was already turning out to be a gore-fest than my eyes caught a glimpse of some other colored fabric in a different part of the tree that was also very high off the ground. I walked around the base of the tree to better position myself in order to see whatever it was more clearly. I realized that not only was I seeing the remains of yet another human being, but there was also what appeared to be a carcass of a deer or elk, some 10 feet away from it, also lying across some large branches. It was at this precise moment in time that I was suddenly keenly aware, deep inside of my innermost being, that I was now being watched. There was no other way of me explaining it to you. I felt as though whoever or whatever had done this terrible deed was now aware that I knew as well, and it, or they, were not happy about it. I had a long hike out, and although I hadn't planned to leave at this part of the day before I had come upon all of this grisly stuff, I knew that I had to leave, and I had to leave now. That's the way I felt at that moment in time. I suddenly felt as though I was now in imminent danger by remaining here, and quite possibly on my way out as well. As I began to make my way out, I must inform you that there were many areas in this forest where something could have easily just jumped on me if it wanted to, and there would be little, if any, time for myself to react. That's just the nature of hunting. We are stalking something in the surroundings in which we ourselves could easily become the hunted if the tables were turned. Today, I was starting to feel as though they had been turned. It must have been a mile or so into my outbound hike when I came into what I will call a shallow valley between two hills. I was retracing the way I had come in earlier that day. The central path between these two hills was damp and soggy to walk on. I could see my boot tracks from earlier in the day when, unexpectedly, there before my eyes, mixed within my own tracks, were these giant imprints of, I can't really describe what kind of tracks they were, made in the same direction as mine coming in. There were about 8 of them, and many alongside of the softer mudded area that I could see. I now knew that I had been followed, or had traversed the same route that I had some time after me. In either case, it could easily see my tracks and where I was heading. These tracks, although I didn't stop to measure them, were very large, and in the softer area, they were all of 6 inches into the ground, whereas my own were maybe an inch. At that moment, the thought had entered my mind that I was going to die in these woods today, and nobody would ever find me. I was hunting with my lever-action Winchester that day, and I chambered around. I had stepped up my pace while being as cautious as I possibly could, taking into consideration the way I felt at the time. When I found myself passing through a very dense grouping of trees, I was only about 30 yards, if that, into this grouping when I heard a loud snap that was followed by a very deep growl to my right. What happened next was the result of a knee-jerk reaction based entirely on a building fear within me. I turned my Winchester and emptied it in a fan pattern, quickly ratcheting off every round. I distinctly remember salvo number 4, because no sooner had I squeezed it off than a scream of demonic proportions erupted from the trees. I thought I had shot the devil himself, and the screaming did not stop. I quickly loaded the gun and repeated the same spray pattern that I had just done, firing off 6 more rounds, and started to run faster than I had ever ran in my entire life. I was running and shoveling more rounds into the breach as best as I could. The last thing I wanted to do was to turn an ankle or worse, and I could hear this thing wailing behind me, having evidently been shot by round number 4. I covered the last 4 miles out to the ranger station faster than I would have believed I could ever run in my lifetime. When I reached the station, the ranger asked me if that was me firing a little while ago up to the north, which I lied and said no, but that I had heard the shots as well. I don't know why. But I didn't want to get into the whole creature thing and have to explain to him what had happened. I did, however, tell him about what I found in the tree, and he was all ears. Well, the next day I led a group of 10 lawmen on foot back to the location. Everyone was shocked, as I was when I first found the bodies. I told the men that I literally did not want to be there anymore, and 2 of them brought me back out. There was some of the usual questioning, as you can imagine, but I think it was obvious to everyone that I hadn't killed these people and put them in the tree. I am sure that I shot that creature that day, but I have no tangible proof other than what I have already told you up to this point. Who these people were, I have no idea, and neither did I follow up at all with the law enforcement to ask any further questions regarding this grisly matter. But I will end by saying this much. No cougar or any other animal is capable of scaling a bare tree trunk to such heights, carrying a human body out onto a limb, and on top of that, coming back to the same tree several more times over and over. This was performed by an act of, I don't know. Tonight's third and final experience. My good friend John just happens to be the landscaper at my home. Some might ask, how does a physicist become friends with a laborer? I will answer that question. Over time, in conversating with John at my home, I found that he had great interest not only in all things plant-related around the house, but with everything found in the forest as well. He, having no formal education whatsoever, other than what he had self-taught himself in the course of being a landscaper, had given me more than a run for my money through the years with the wealth of knowledge he possessed in regards to all things botanical. Having had many invaluable conversations with him over time, and knowing him to be as fit as a fiddle, at some point the two of us became engaged in regular forest hikes together, as a somewhat leisurely activity to form of staying fit, and so the bond of landscaper and physicist was formed. Over a period of 15 years, John and I have been through just about every square mile of the Great Smoky National Park and Nantahala National Forest. I would be willing to wager, if it could be proven, that the two of us have hiked 100,000 miles together between the two wildernesses. In the summer of 2015, we made our way over to Clingman's Dome Observation Tower. From there, we were scoping out some promising areas in the region of Little River tributaries. The following weekend, we hiked into the area coming from the Newfound Gap Road in the area of Chimney Tops and immediately found ourselves in the midst of an extremely rigorous hike through the timber. Our plan for the day was to hike until we hit water and then follow what we found until we ran out of time. Our typical day hike involves allowing ourselves enough time to get in and out of where we were, including the possibility of one of us turning an ankle or the likes, which has actually happened. You do not want to be stuck in the forest at night. We were 3 hours in when we heard a tremendous crash of a tree falling to the ground to our southwest. After hearing that, we decided to alter our plan to find that tree that had fallen, so we commenced to hike in that direction. We had walked about another mile when we heard yet a second tree come crashing down, followed by what sounded like a loud conversation in foreign dialect. To me, it sounded like one of a Siberian dialect, of which I do not speak nor do I understand. John and I, being uncertain as to what we had just walked into, started to move much more slowly, and yet, nevertheless, stayed the course to find those who were talking. After stalking for what must have been another 100 yards, this jabbering conversation was getting ever louder. Suddenly, we saw a huge black creature moving just ahead, and the two of us simultaneously dropped to our knees behind some brush. The beast had walked behind maybe 6 or 7 trees and seemed to be talking as it did so. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it moved out of sight. We were astonished at what we had just seen. It was unmistakably a large bipedal giant covered in brown fur and the size of an ox. I can tell you that it was all of 4 meters tall and better than a meter thick at the very least. It had the physique of a massive bodybuilder, and we had no desire to learn how they were feeling trees. For fear of our own lives, John and I immediately started to retreat, not knowing how we would be greeted should we be found out by this creature and its cohort. As we backtracked, we could hear 2 very distinct voices, one being higher pitched than the other in its tone. They were making so much noise between the speech and the rustling of timber that we had no fear of being heard as we retreated from our position. It was obvious to us that they were not expecting any company in these woods and were doing nothing to quiet themselves in any way. Some may say, why didn't you stay and see more and listen to them? To which I would retort, unless you wanted to die, there was no reason to stay. We were so frightened by the very sight of one monster that we did not need to see the second. All we wanted to do was get out of there, and quickly. In Russia, we have a saying similar to that which I have heard in this country, that being, I will believe it when I see it. Well, that day, I had moved from being a skeptic about creatures in the forest to being a full-on believer, having now seen one with my own eyes. Besides the actual sighting, the most amazing aspect was that of spoken language between the two. There was a distinct back and forth like 2 old-fashioned washwomen going on between them the entire time we were near them. To date, it is the most incredible event of my lifetime. And there you have it, folks. I do hope you all enjoyed today's bonus as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to really thank you all for supporting the channel. After all, it is your support that keeps this channel growing and going, and honestly what gives us all a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free. Everyone is simply treated with the respect that we deserve, and I do appreciate it, so thank you. Please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real. These events have happened. Please share this information with the people you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless you all.